Offaly History welcomes you to this broadcast today, which is about the poet John Frazer, the poet from Birr. We are delighted to be involved in a venture to publish the entire poetry collection of this Birr poet in one volume. This has not been done before, and Fraser himself was known as the poet of the Young Ireland movement and as the poet of the working man. The early 1840s was an exciting period in Irish history, with the work of Clarence Mangan, the poet, and of Thomas Davis, among many others, in Young Ireland. And it was the period when Daniel O'Connell was having the Great Repeal meetings, which ultimately ended up unsuccessfully and followed later by the famine of 1846-49. So it's been a very difficult period. And to tell us more about all of that and about the work of John Frazer, I want to welcome today Terry Moylan and Pádraig Turley, who with their co-editor Laurel Grube have prepared and edited this forthcoming publication of what I have said is the first ever publication of his works in one volume. Michael Byrne is my name, and I'm the Secretary of Offaly History, and I want to thank all of the editors, both here and also Laurel, who is in the United States. I also want to express our thanks to Amanda Pedlow, the Heritage Officer in County Offaly, to the members of Offaly County Council, and to Creative Ireland for their financial support for this volume. We in Offaly History are delighted to be associated with this venture, and we have the benefit of the expertise that I've already mentioned. Terry is a well-known musical historian, and he's an author of many books of historical interest, but principally his monumental work, The Indignant Muse, which is a collection of the poetry and songs of the Irish Revolution over the period 1887 to 1926. We are delighted to have a copy of that book in our own library, and we note how favourably it was received when it was published a few years ago. Poetic is a retired solicitor with a lifelong interest in Offaly history and is a very faithful member of our Offaly History Society. In addition, he has published many blogs on subjects to do with West Offaly and his own background and that of his family in the county. Laurel Grube can't be with us, and she is a lineal descendant of Fraser. She lives in Florida and has always taken an interest in her famous ancestor. In fact, her middle name is Jean, thus continuing the name from John Frazer. So now I'm very happy to hand over to Terry and Pádraig for this presentation, and I hope that you will enjoy it, and of course that when the publication appears in October, that you will support the book by purchasing a copy. Thank you very much.
We must look at the background to the times he lived in. At the outset, it might be wise to look at the events, to use the current phraseology, that were soundtrack to his life. What was the background to his life's work? What sort of newsworthy events were in his ear? We know he lived from 1804-1802 to 1852, a time of change when the sands were forever shifting. He would have grown up very much aware of the recent revolutions, both in America and France. He had seen how the French Revolution eventually led to the rise of Napoleon. He was a teenager when the Napoleonic Wars ended. The 1798 and Robert Emmet rebellions were fresh in folks' minds. The Act of Union between Ireland and Britain had only recently been brought into effect by Castlereagh, using very dubious means. The Second Reformation was in full flow with evangelical vigour. O'Connell's repeal movement would have been an everyday presence. Catholic emancipation was a long-running sore which had folk worked up. Castlereagh had held out the promise of Catholic emancipation at the time of the Union, but the king blocked it. The Peterloo massacre of 1819 would have been a teenage experience and may well have influenced him towards working class concerns. The fictional character Ned Ludd of Luddite fame had craft workers up in arms. The opulence of the Regency and the reign of George IV no doubt horrified him. The tide wars of 1830s and the agrarian unrest were an echo to his life. The orange and green, shall we say, differences, sadly still ongoing, were a running sore. The calamity of the Great Famine was probably the greatest disaster in his lifetime, which clearly affected him and is reflected in his poetry, and of course not forgetting the earlier famines of 1830-32, which affected Mayo, Donegal and Galway, and 1835, which affected Ulster. The 1848 Young Ireland Rebellion certainly engaged him. Who was he? The quick answer is that he was a poet, a cabinet maker, and a watercolour painter of some merit. He was from what was then known as Parsonstown, now of course Birr. However, there is a bit of a dispute over this. We all recall Brandon Bean saying that when a group of Irish folk get together for a venture, the first item on the agenda is the split. One will find suggestions that he was born near Maistown, others suggest near Ferban. These are mostly from newspapers of the 21st century. I believe the basis for these ideas are to be found in his poem Brosna's Banks. However, during our research, we found a report in the Pilot of the 19th of February 1854 describing this poem as referring to a tributary of the Shannon that runs between Kings County and Tipperary. This is, of course, the Little Brosna. He was a regular contributor to the Pilot. A number of his poems, about which Terry shall be talking later, are cited in Birr and its environs, so I feel reasonably confident that he was from Birr. In Ard na HÉireann, the magazine of Tullamore branch of the Gaelic League, we find a piece by Sean McCaulta in October 1903, which says he was apprenticed to a cabinet maker in Green Street, Birr. His actual date of birth is not known, but I think we can safely say he was born in 1803-4. When he died in 1852, his age was given as 48, thus giving credence to 1803-4 as his time of birth. You will find some references that give his date of birth as 1809, but I feel this can't be correct. He is credited with the poem Eva O'Connor, which was published in 1826, a monumental poem which I feel would be beyond a 17-year-old. It is believed that he was born into a Presbyterian family, but unfortunately records of Presbyterian baptisms for Birr only commence in the 1840s. Certainly when we look at his poetry, we see a huge biblical influence, which points to a Protestant grounding. We know he had at least one brother from his poem, The Memory of a Young Artist, only brother of the artist. We also believe he had at least one sister, Elizabeth Daly, who was interred in the same grave as John in 1862, where her age is given as 52. What may be of interest, due to Fraser's family's straitened circumstances, is that Elizabeth and John Daly lived in 4 Salem Terrace, South Circle Road, Dublin, which is located in a fine row of 2-storey houses built in 1845. From the Dublin street directories of the time, it seems the Dalys owned the property. This suggests that they were not poor, perhaps venturing on middle class. He died very young, and we know he suffered from bad health for a number of years. We find many references to his ill health. An interesting example can be found in Lady Mary Ferguson's book, Sir Samuel Ferguson in the Ireland of his time, and she tells of a visit to Fraser in 1848 by herself and her husband, Samuel Ferguson, while on their honeymoon. She talks of the visit to the poor but decent home of the sickly mechanic, the poet Fraser, who, while earning his crust in a poor town dwelling by manual labour, could project his imagination into the scenes of his childhood on the bog of Clondalagh and the banks of the Brosna, which he celebrated in verse. The family. What do we know about his family? We do not have exact details of his marriage. After a bit of sleuth work, I discovered his wife was one Letitia Reynolds. I discovered this on the marriage record of his daughter Mary Ann's second marriage to John Donovan, where Mary Anna's parents are given as John Frazer and Letitia Reynolds. This is also confirmed by such baptismal records of his children as exist. Letitia died 9th of March 1872, at which time she was residing at 35 Mary Street, Dublin, and was described as a widow of a cabinet maker, aged 72 years. Oddly, she was not described as the widow of a poet. I don't know where she hailed from. It seems she was a Roman Catholic by religion, certainly as some of her children were baptised in St. Mary's Pro Cathedral, Dublin. John and Letitia had at least 6 children that we know of. Their names were Louisa, Letitia, Robert Alexander, Jane, John and Mary Ann. As well as giving them great joy, there was much tragedy. Louisa died on April 1845, aged 15, from influenza. This gave rise to his poem, To a Daughter's Memory. Robert Alexander died in February 1845, also from influenza. This tragedy gave rise to the poem, The Reason for the Poet's Silence. Losing 2 children within a period of 3 months must have had a terrible blow. One has to ask if these tragedies were to contribute to his early death. Their daughter Letitia went on to marry the hardline Fenian Thomas Clark Luby and had 4 children, James, John, Catherine, and the Thomas Clark Ranald Luby, who died in infancy. I have been unable to trace what happened to Jane. John married one Emily McNally, and they had at least 1 child, Emily Fraser. John stayed in Ireland. Mary Ann married John Walsh, also well-known Fenian from Baltracy, County Kildare. Walsh died quite young in America. Mary Ann later married one John Donovan, and our fellow editor Laurel Grube is descended from this union. What was his religion? As I indicated earlier, we do not have any baptismal records for him. However, all evidence suggests he was born into the Presbyterian family. Desmond McCabe, in Fraser's entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, says he was born into a Presbyterian family believed to be of Huguenot extraction. His father is said to be a minister of that faith. McCabe tells us that by 1844 he had converted to Catholicism. I have been unable to locate any baptismal certificate to mark this event. However, I have been informed that if he had already been baptized in a Christian ceremony, he would not have required a further baptism, which I understand is prohibited under Canon Law 845. This did not prevent him criticising the Catholic Church when he felt the occasion demanded it, as when the Church condemned the Young Irelanders. Clearly, the dissenter gene carried through. Some of his children were baptised Catholics and some Presbyterians. This may be explained by the fact that his wife was a Catholic. I understand that there was a convention in the 1800s that male children of mixed marriages were brought up Catholic and daughters Protestant. His daughter Letitia, on her marriage to Thomas Clark Luby, declared himself Presbyterian. It is also suggested that he was sworn into the Orange Order in his youth, but recanted under the influence of O'Connor. I have not been able to verify this, but one finds so many references to it that it is in all probability true. Where is he buried? Fraser is interred in Glasnevin Cemetery. As you can see from the photo, he lies very much in the shadow of Daniel O'Connell, whose repeal movement first fired Fraser with an enthusiasm for Irish nationalism. The lack of progress of the repeal movement brought him into the fold of the Young Ireland movement. As you can see, the grave is unmarked, which is a shame. Laurel Grube, who is very interested in having a suitable monument erected to mark the grave, as indeed we are. The final lines of his poem Brosnet Banks are worth noting. If then the gifted, good and brave admit me to their glorious ranks, my memory may, though not my grave, be green upon Brosnet's banks. Also interred in this grave are his children Robert and Louise, and Elizabeth Daly, who I believe to be his sister. His wife Letitia is interred in a different plot in Glasnevin. There are references to him in the GA. Long before Michael Cusack set up the GA, we find in one of Fraser's poems a reference to a hurling game. In his lovely poem Clondalkin, he is reminiscing on his youth around Birr when we find the lines, and regrets ways be yet from the crash on the Callow when the matched hurlers met on the plains of Clondalkin. As a slight aside, this poem is very relevant to Birr folk, for in the National Folklore Commission Schools Collection there is a contribution by F. Kennedy via the Birr Mercy Convent in 1938 which featured the poem. I certainly believe Fraser and Michael Cusack would have been on the same political phrase. Cusack, a strong, some say ultra-nationalist, once resided in the Dergvale Hotel, which became a strong trade union haunt, which would tally with Fraser's political leanings. Cusack was somewhat unfairly lampooned by James Joyce in the figure of the citizen in Ulysses. As we all know, or should know, the GAA was founded in 1884. Of course, Offaly people are very proud of the fact the first ever All-Ireland hurling final was played in Birr in April 1887. While we were researching for this work, we began to come across references to a GAA team called the Jeans, operating in Dublin. We found a number of notices in the Freeman's Journal to this team, the Jeans, playing against teams like St. Kevin's, Goldsmiths, Erin's Hope, Clonliffe, Sextons. Rather ironically, their assembly point was always the Gough Monument in the Phoenix Park, and the games were usually played in the 15 acres. On further investigation, we found this club affiliated to the Dublin County Board of the GAA in 1888 with the caption, a Fenian poet of the 1860s. This was clearly an error, as he was a Young Ireland poet. However, after 1888, this team just disappears without trace. They may very well have been convulsed by the Parnell split and never regrouped when the dust settles. However, their existence is a tribute to our subject, and of course an Offaly footprint in Dublin GAA.
The poems written by Fraser in the first half of the 19th century were created at a time when the word poetry signified texts written in well-defined verbal structures which had various shapes in the form of the number and arrangements of syllables or of stresses in a line. Regularity and symmetry were regarded as beautiful and desirable. The lines could also be ornamented with such devices as rhyme, assonance, and alliteration, and the expressed thoughts could be heightened through the use of metaphor, contrast, and imagery. In the 20th century, the idea of adherence to conventional rhythmic structures was abandoned, and on these grounds, Fraser's poetry has been described as written in an outmoded style. That's no reason to ignore him. The word music that he wove into his verse is still there to be enjoyed, just as we still enjoy the works of his contemporaries, Beethoven, Wagner and Chopin, or Goya, Delacroix and Turner, all similarly creators in outmoded styles. Eva O'Connor was published when Fraser was just 22 years old. It is the story of the life and death of a woman ruined and abandoned by a faithless lover. In nearly 2,000 lines, the author explores and describes the thoughts and emotions of a person in distress and despair. Another writer might have taken the theme and made a novel of psychological insight from it. Fraser's art produced an epic poem from the material. It is daunting to contemplate, but once started, it reads like a novel with the bonus of Fraser's imaginative verse. Poems for the people. In the 1840s, Fraser clearly became politicised and developed nationalist opinions. He was attracted to O'Connell's repeal agitation and began to contribute poems to the periodicals of the time, mostly on political events and expressing nationalist views. These were anthologized in 1845 in this collection. After the effective defeat of repeal in 1843, the poems began to reveal Fraser's disappointment and recriminations with the leaders. By 1851, Fraser was in poor health, and this collection was published by his friends as a way of providing an income for him. It contains a number of lengthy narrative pieces, the form that had first inspired him, as well as political material, love poems, poems of place, and laments for lost members of his family. The longest piece, the biblical Jephthah's Vow, is based on the story in chapter 11 of the book of Judges, where the leader of the Gileadites is obliged to sacrifice his daughter due to a rash vow that he made. As with Eva O'Connor, the thoughts, emotions and motivations of the protagonists are forensically explored in the manner of a psychological thriller. The collection also includes Fraser's most popular poems about his own home place and poems on themes from Irish history. In 1851, and in poor health, Fraser embarked on a new venture. He established and ran a new periodical, the Irish Trades Advocate. Published in October and November 1851, it ran for only 7 weekly issues before Fraser's death. The paper was socialist and trade unionist in tone, and in each issue, under the heading Lays of Labour, Fraser included a poem sympathetic to working men's issues such as fair wages, conditions, etc. The poems were signed J.A.C. Plain. A cabinet maker and upholsterer by trade, Fraser would have used a jack plane in his work. The poems that were written after the famine but not included in Fraser's final collection of 1851 include some of the most trenchantly political of his pieces, including those specifically dealing with the famine. Fraser's first passion was simply to explore how stories with deep emotional content could be explored in the form of long narrative verse. His first published work consisted solely of this type of poetry, and he returned to it later with Jephthah's Vow and other pieces in his 1851 anthology and in his posthumously published Blanche. His other main preoccupation was nationalist politics, and his poems in this vein contain a great number of memorable and quotable lines. He also displayed his sentimental and emotional side in his poems of place and his poems about lost family members. Other writers and composers have taken the story of Jephthah's Vow from the Book of Judges and created modern artworks based on it. Fraser chose to use the form of narrative verse. Fraser was politicised by the events of his time, particularly the agitation for repeal of the Union of Ireland with Great Britain that had come into force in 1801, just before Fraser's birth, and had come to be seen as leading to the progressive economic and social ruin of Ireland. The machinations of the Westminster Parliament and government to defeat the repeal campaign, and the open contempt there expressed for Irish concerns, were outrageous provocations to Irish feeling. Fraser followed the proceedings of Parliament closely and commented on them in many poems which were published in The Nation, The Freeman's Journal, and other periodicals. In the mid-19th century, Irish writers had begun to publish accounts of Irish history from an Irish point of view, often overturning slanted accounts of events penned by British historians. Poems and songs of place form an important part of the Irish folk tradition, and Fraser created several affecting pieces in this genre, remembering and praising the charms of his home place of Birr and County Offaly. Late in life, Fraser suddenly displayed a radical labour consciousness in his poems entitled Lays of Labour, contained in his self-published Irish Trades Advocate. The sentiments expressed extend not merely to demands for better wages and conditions, but include a socialist questioning of the whole structure of society. Fraser suffered several personal tragedies, the loss of his younger brother and of 2 of his children, a son and a daughter. He mourned these in very affecting terms and wrote very little after the deaths of his children. In a couple of cases, Fraser wrote in a very honest way of the difficulties and disappointments of love, apparently recording his own feelings and experiences. The use of structures and rhythms defined by convention has been the very definition of poetry for thousands of years, only being overturned by modernism in the 20th century. Repeated regular rhythms and symmetrically structured lines are the basis of Fraser's verse. He used many different forms and often changed them within single pieces, imparting great variety to his poetry and avoiding the tedium that could be caused by constant use of the same structures. These examples show some of the variety of his verse forms. Notwithstanding Milton's strictures on the subject, which he ignored on occasion himself, rhyme and assonance are devices that poets have always used as part of the word music that makes poetry different from prose. Fraser used rhyme in different ways to enhance his verse, including internal and end rhymes. Alliteration, the clustering of words with identical initial sounds, is another time-honoured way of turning words into music. Fraser used the device abundantly, but without seeming to strain for effect. The lines always seem to contain ordinary language, miraculously arranged into rhythmic patterns and adorned with rhymes and alliteration composed of ordinary words. In Fraser's poems, the mind is regularly diverted by the way he illustrates the point he is making, by comparisons, contrasts, and imagery. In this way he succeeds in making us clearly understand the way he perceives matters and entertains us at the same time.